The stone was too heavy for one woman. Everyone in the valley agreed on that. Yet every morning, before the light had even touched the frozen grass, she was out there again, bent low, dragging another slab up from the creek, setting it against the others, slow and sure, like she was answering some voice no one else could hear. She did not build a fence. She did not bank the walls with sod, the way sensible folk did. She raised a thick shell of cold gray rock all the way around her little house. And then she left a gap, a hollow ring of empty air between the stone and the timber, touching nothing. The neighbors slowed their wagons to stare. A widow, alone, with two small children behind that door. Hands split to the bone, building a wall that protected nothing they could see. They called it grief. They called it madness. Some of them stopped calling it all. But she kept lifting stone, because she had buried enough already, and because she knew something about the wind that not one of them had ever bothered to learn. The winter was coming for her children, and she did not intend to lose another thing to the cold. The cold did not arrive all at once. It came the way grief comes, slow, then sudden. First a thinning of the light in the afternoons, then a hardness in the morning ground that had not been there the week before. The tall grass on the open land turned the color of old bone, and the wide sky that had been so generous all summer pulled low and gray, like a lid settling over a pot. In a small house at the edge of a quiet valley, a woman felt the season turn before she could name it. Her name was Cora Hale. She was not yet old, though the year had aged her in ways no mirror could measure. She had the kind of face that had once been soft and had since been taught otherwise. Her hands told the truer story. They had begun the summer smooth. They would not end the winter that way. She had 2 children, and no husband to help her raise them. The boy was Toby, 6 years old, and grave the way some children become when the world asks too much of them too soon. He woke each morning already braced for the day, as if sleep itself were a thing he could not quite afford. The girl was Etta, 4, still soft with the trust of the very young. She burrowed deep into the quilt each dawn and had to be lifted out of it, blinking and warm and certain, still, that the world meant her no harm. Cora meant to keep her certain of that for as long as she possibly could. The house they lived in was a poor thing. Her husband had built it in haste, in their first spring on the land, and he had built it wrong. Not from carelessness, from hope. He had cut the timber while the sap still ran high in it, and he had laid the logs green. And green wood does what green wood always does. It shrank. It pulled away from itself as it dried, opening long thin seams between the logs, seams that the wind discovered and never forgot. By the time the first hard cold came, the chinking had curled away in ribbons, and the wind ran through the rooms at every hour with a thin, spiteful whistle, a sound she had come to hate more than almost any other. A house should hold its people. This one only sheltered them between gusts. Elias was gone by then. He had not meant to leave her. Men rarely do. He had ridden out one raw morning on an errand he never explained, and the cold had taken him on the road, far from any door, and they had not found him until it was much too late to matter. She had buried him on the rise east of the house, and she had told herself, in the long, numb days after, that the worst was behind her now. that a woman who had survived that could survive anything the land cared to send. She had been wrong about that. The worst was still coming. It came on a night deep in the heart of that first winter alone. The wind had been at the seams all evening, and the fire in the small stove had been losing its long, quiet war against the dark. Cora had banked it as high as she dared. She had stuffed rags into the worst of the gaps. She had lain down between her children with the quilt pulled to their chins, listening to the house breathe cold around them. And somewhere past the middle of the night, Etta began to burn. The girl woke crying, and the cry was wrong. Too thin, too tight, her small body laboring against something it could not push away. Her breath came in shallow little rattles, and Cora could hear them clear across the dark room before she had even risen from the bed. She had the child in her arms in a single motion. The skin was fever hot. The lips had gone a color skin should never go, and the cabin around them was so cold that Cora's own breath hung white in the air above her daughter's burning face. The two of them, fire and frost, in the same trembling hold. She fed the stove. She fed it until her arms shook and the woodpile shrank and the heat went straight up the flue and out into a sky that swallowed it whole. She wrapped the girl. She held her against her chest and walked the small room, back and forth, because stillness felt like surrender. She watched the lamp flame lean and gutter every time the wind shoved past it. And somewhere in those long hours, a hard truth came and sat down beside her and would not leave. Warmth in this place was not a thing a body could rely on. It was not a comfort. It was a wage she had to earn over again every single hour, all night long, with wood she did not have enough of, against a creditor that never slept and never closed its books and never, ever showed mercy. She could feed the fire until her arms gave out, and the cold would still find the cracks. It would still pour in. It would still reach for her daughter's chest in the dark. The fire was not failing because she was weak. The fire was failing because the house itself was wrong. Etta lived through that night. So did her brother, who had woken and watched with those grave dark eyes, and said nothing, because he was 6, and already understood that there was nothing useful to say. By the gray of dawn, the fever had broken. The girl slept, finally, her breath gone soft and even, and Cora sat beside her with her back against the cold log wall and did not sleep at all. She watched the light come up, and one thought turned over and over in her chest, slow and bright and heavy as a coin pressed into a palm. They would not live through another winter like the last one. Not in this house. Not as it stood. Not with the wind owning every seam and the fire losing every night, and her children one bad cold away from a grave she would have to dig in frozen ground. Something had to change, and there was no one left to change it but her. The change did not look like much at first. It looked like a woman walking down to the dry creek bed in the gray cold of an autumn morning. It looked like her crouching among the broken stones the water had left behind, turning them in her ruined hands, choosing some and leaving others by a logic no one watching could have followed. It looked like her dragging the first slab up the rise toward the house, and setting it down in the dirt, a few feet out from the wall. Touching nothing, she went back for another, and another. By the end of that first day, there was a small line of stone lying in the frost-stiff grass, well clear of the cabin, following no shape that made any sense. By the end of the week, the line had begun to rise. By the end of the month, it had become a thing the whole valley had started to talk about. A wall of solid rock, going up all the way around her little house, thick along the side where the winter wind was born, lower along the side where the weak sun fell. Heavy, gray, brutish stone, fitted and stacked and bound with a crude mortar, she mixed herself in a shallow pit. And here was the part that made no sense to anyone. The wall did not touch the house. She left a gap, a hollow ring of empty air running all the way around, between the cold stone on the outside and the timber on the inside. A margin of nothing, carefully kept, deliberately held open. The neighbors slowed their wagons on the section road to watch her at it. What they saw was a widow, alone, bent double under granite that should have taken 2 strong men to lift. They saw her hands going from soft to cracked to bleeding. They saw her building, stone by stone, a wall that surrounded a house it did not protect, a wall with a hole of empty air at its very heart. They could not imagine what the gap was for. And people, when they cannot imagine a reason for a thing, do not often go looking for one. They simply decide the thing has no reason at all. Most of the valley settled the question the easy way. Grief, they said. The poor woman had buried her man and her good sense along with him. The cold had gotten into her thinking. You could see it, couldn't you, in the way she worked. That look in her eye. The more kindly among them called it sorrow. The less kindly called it something closer to madness. But Cora Hale heard none of it, or chose to hear none of it, and she did not stop. Each morning, before the light had done more than smear thin and watery along the eastern edge of the world, she rose. She banked the stove with what good wood remained. She set the oatmeal where it would not scorch. She woke her children with a hand laid soft on each small shoulder. Then she walked out into the cold and gathered more stone. The work remade her body as surely as it was remaking her home. Her shoulders broadened under the weight. Her palms split and healed and split again, the cracks filling with dried clay until she studied her hands by lamplight some nights and did not quite know them. The soft hands she had brought into her marriage were gone. She did not grieve them. She had traded them for something she needed more. And here is the thing the valley did not know. Here is the thing that not one of the people slowing their wagons to gawk had ever once suspected. The woman raising that wall was not building it out of grief or madness or some broken notion the cold had put into her head. She was building it out of memory. She had not always lived on the open land. She had come from somewhere else entirely, a hard, rocky coast, far away, where the cold came in off the water with a wet edge that found the marrow faster than any dry wind ever could. A place where the weather was a teacher, and the lessons were not gentle. Her father had been a stonemason there. His name was Silas Vane, and he had been a hard man, hard the way the granite he worked was hard, slow to warm, sparing with his praise to the point of a cruelty he likely never even saw in himself. He was not a father who held his daughter, or told her she was loved, or softened the edges of the world for her. He gave her only one thing. He gave her what he knew. She had trailed him as a small girl through every season of his work, watching his broad, scarred hands fit stone to stone, watching him build things meant to outlast the weather, meant to outlast him, meant to outlast her. He did not explain himself. He let the stone make his arguments for him. But there had been one day he had crouched down beside her, with the lime and the damp earth strong on his hands, and he had told her a thing she had carried ever since. A thing she had carried across the years and the long miles, all the way to this cold valley, all the way to this very wall. He had been building a small shed that day, a strange little structure, a tight box of planked wood set inside a loose outer shell of fitted stone, with a hollow running all the way around between the two. She had pushed her small hand into that gap. The air in it had been cool, still, untouched by the wind that scoured everything else on that bitter coast bare. And her father, who never explained himself, had explained. "The cold is not the enemy, girl." His voice in the memory was a low, grinding rumble, the sound of something heavy shifting far underground. The great cold lives off yonder, and on its own, it means you no harm. What does the killing is its runner? The wind. The wind takes the cold up on its back, and it drives it into every crack a careless man leaves open. It rubs the heat clean out of your bones before ever you know it's gone. He had laid his broad hand against the outer stones. This here is the shield. It stands, and it takes the blow, and it turns it. Then he had touched the hollow, the gap, the nothing, and this is the blanket. Still air carries nothing at all. It only holds. It is the warmest coat the Lord ever made. And it weighs nothing in your hand, and it costs nothing out of your purse. The villagers on that far coast had thought him an odd man, the same way her neighbors here thought her an odd woman now. But his sheds had stood, his walls had held. He had understood the secret that lay underneath all of it, that a pocket of carefully guarded emptiness was a stronger thing than any solid wall a man could ever raise against the weather. The cold was not stopped by fighting it. The cold was stopped by understanding the way it moved, and then quietly, patiently, taking that movement away from it. So this was not madness, the wall going up in the frozen valley. This was inheritance. This was a hard man's knowledge, carried a long way in a daughter's two hands, and set down whole on new and crueler ground. But the valley could not see that. The valley saw only the gap, the hole of empty air, the widow building a wall around nothing, and the gap was exactly where they were most certain she had gone wrong. The first to put the talk to her face was a man named Garrett Mercer. He came up the road on a raw gray morning, broad and weathered and somewhere past 40, a man who had broken sod and buried more than he cared to recall, and who carried himself like someone who had never once doubted the things he believed. He drew his team to a halt and sat a while, watching her lever a flat slab onto the bed of her barrow. Then he climbed down slow, the way a man climbs down when he means to stay, and be heard. He walked to the half-built wall along the cold side of the house, and he laid his bare palm flat against the stone, the way a man feels the flank of a sick animal. He turned the thing over in his mind, hunting for the plain sense he believed lay beneath everything. He did not find it. Mrs. Hale. His voice was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was certain. What in the Lord's name is it you think you're doing out here? She wiped the grit from her hands onto her apron, and she met his eyes without heat. She had been expecting one of them sooner or later. And of all the men in the valley, Garrett Mercer, with his solid, unexamined faith in the way things had always been done, was as likely a candidate as any. "I'm getting ready for winter, Mr. Mercer," she said, level, plain, nothing in it she would have to answer for later. He slapped the granite, and it gave back a dull, dead thud that seemed, to him, to settle the whole matter. "By raising yourself a wall of ice." He said it like a man explaining water to a fish. "Come the first hard freeze, this rock will be colder than a grave dug in February. It'll pull the warm straight out of your logs and hand it to the wind. You bank your foundation with sod, the way folk have always done it, and you live to tell of it. I'll spare you a day to set it right. I'd not see a widow freeze for the want of a neighbor's two hands." It was an offer of help, and the trap was coiled inside it. The help came tied to a condition, that she give up the thing she was building, and take his certainty in its place. She might have let it go. She knew, even as she opened her mouth, that explaining was very likely a wasted breath. That watching a thing happen and understanding why it happened were two different acts, and that most people never once crossed the distance between them. But she tried, because her children were inside the house at her back, and because the truth deserved at least one fair hearing before she gave it up as unwelcome. "The stone isn't for warmth, Mr. Mercer." She looked past his shoulder, out to the open country where the wind was born. That vast, unhoused sky the storms came down from every year like an army no one had ever turned back. "The stone is to break the wind. The warmth lives in the air I'm leaving, between the wall and the house. Still air carries no cold. It only holds whatever little heat a body makes, and keeps it close." His brow folded. She watched him reach the edge of what he could hold in his mind, and find nothing there to take the new idea by the hand. "Air," he said. He said the word the way a man says it when you've handed him a stone and called it bread. "The air is the cold itself, woman. You mean to trap the very thing that's trying to kill you." He shook his head, and the gesture had a terrible finality in it. The closing of a door he had no intention of opening a second time. He went back to his horse, and at the wagon he paused and turned, and the last thing he left her with was not anger. It was pity, which landed harder than anger ever could have. "You're a hard-headed man, Mrs. Hale." A beat. The wind moving between them. "For the sake of those little ones, I hope your grief hasn't froze your good sense along with everything else." Then the wheels turned, and the wagon dwindled down the road, and Cora stood in the settling dust with a cold that owed nothing at all to the season hardening somewhere behind her ribs. They saw a widow gone strange with sorrow, and they would go on seeing exactly that, she knew, until the proof grew too plain to argue with. She turned back to the wall. The stone she had been fitting waited where she had left it, patient, heavy, asking nothing of her but her back and her 2 hands, and she bent to it once more. The children were her witnesses, and her reason both. Toby took to the work with a seriousness that wrung her heart. He carried the smallest flat stones to her, one at a time, holding each against his chest like something precious. He called them his closers, because he had heard the word from her, and he lined them up at her feet in a careful row, proud past all measure. She let him help long past the point where his help was of any use, because the pride in his small grave face was worth more to her than the minutes it cost. Etta built her own walls, close by on a spread blanket. Tiny ramparts of pebbles and dry twigs, with a whole kingdom of friends only she could see. And the small bright thread of her chatter was the line Cora held to, on the days the work felt like more than one woman ought to owe the world. She had no one else. The valley had decided what she was. The men slowed their wagons and shook their heads. The women spoke behind their hands. And the only voices that did not doubt her were the 2 small ones inside that drafty house, who loved her too simply to imagine she could be wrong. Some nights, when the children slept, the doubt came for her anyway. It came in the dark, the way doubt always does. It sat on her chest and asked her, in Garrett Mercer's certain voice, what she thought she was doing. It reminded her how the work had cracked her hands and bent her back and eaten the daylight. It told her, very quietly, that perhaps the whole valley could not be wrong, and perhaps one grieving widow could. And on those nights she would rise from the bed she no longer shared. She would stand at the small window in the cold and look out at the wall, the dark shape of it, half finished, rising against the iron sky. And she would press her hand flat to the icy glass and remember the weight of a child burning in her arms while the fire lost and the wind won. That memory always answered the doubt. It answered it the same way, every time. Not in this house. Not as it stands. Never again. And in the morning she would rise before the light and bank the stove and set the oatmeal and wake her children with a hand on each small shoulder and walk back out into the cold and gather more stone. She did not know, yet, how the long winter would test her. She did not know about the letter she would find, or the truth it would tell her about the man she had buried, or the storm that was even then gathering somewhere far out over the open land, waiting to come down and decide, once and for all, whether one hard season of belief and one autumn of ruinous labor had bought her family anything at all. She knew only the next stone, and the one after that. She knew the wall did not care what the valley believed about it. The wall cared only whether it would stand, whether the still air it cradled would do the quiet, invisible work her father had promised her it would do, on a far coast a lifetime ago, with his rough hand closed over her small one. Those questions would be answered by the winter, and by nothing else under heaven. So she built, stone by stone, in the shortening days, with the gray sky pressing low and the wind testing her seams, and the whole valley certain she had lost her mind. She built a shield of cold rock, and inside it a blanket of nothing at all. And she waited for the cold to come, and tell her which of them was the fool. The wall rose by inches, slow as a tide coming in, patient as the dead. Highest along the side where the winter wind was born, lower along the side where the thin sun came to rest a few short hours each day. And as the stone climbed, so did something else. Something a woman cannot stack or measure or hold in her two hands: the loneliness. It is one thing to be doubted by strangers. A widow can carry that. Strangers pass, and their opinions pass with them, down the road and out of mind. It is another thing entirely to be doubted by every soul you know. The valley had made up its mind about Cora Hale, and once a place decides what a woman is, it stops looking at her with open eyes. The wagons still slowed on the section of road. The men still leaned and watched and shook their heads. But the watching had changed now, gone from confusion to something settled, something pitying. The way people look at a thing they have already grieved and tucked away. She felt it in the small places. She felt it at the trading post, where the talk would thin and drop when she came through the door and pick back up, lower, once she had passed. She would stand with her short list and her few coins, and feel the quiet shift around her like a draft under a door. No one asked after the children anymore. That was the cut that went deepest. In the old days, before, there had always been a woman to ask after Toby's growing, after Etta's chatter, to press a warm word into her hand on a cold morning. Now there was nothing, because to ask after the children would mean to look at what their mother was doing out there on her claim, and looking was uncomfortable, and people will travel a long way around their own discomfort, even when the long way runs straight past a lonely woman's heart. She had been a wife once, folded warm into the ordinary life of the place, a name people were glad to see coming. Now she was the widow on the edge of it, the strange one, the lesson the mothers used gently with their daughters about what sorrow could do to a sensible mind. She did not weep over it. She had no time left over for weeping, and besides, weeping was a thing you did when there was someone to see it and be moved. There was no one. So she folded the hurt down small and put it away on a high shelf in herself where she would not have to look at it. But it was there. Some evenings, after the children slept, she would sit alone by the small stove, with her cracked hands open and useless in her lap, and feel the whole size of the silence in that house. No husband across the room with his pipe, no neighbors knock at the door, no voice in all the wide cold dark that believed she was anything but lost. Only the wind at the seams, and the wall outside, growing in the dark, rising toward a promise that not one living soul but her could hear. So when a kind voice finally came, it very nearly undid her. It belonged to a woman named Verena Calder. She was a widow too, in her own way, holding her own claim a few miles off by nothing but grit and a set jaw. She came riding over now and again with no sermon folded inside her coat and no pity tucked into her sleeve. She would bring a warm loaf wrapped in cloth, a jar of something put up the autumn before. Small things, plain things, the kind of things women give each other when words would only get in the way. And she did not ask what the wall was for. That was the heart of it. The whole valley wanted to ask, or to tell, or to fix. Verena only watched. She would tie her horse and stand a while at the edge of the work with her hands tucked into her shawl and study the rising stone with a still, level curiosity. The look of a woman trying to learn a thing rather than judge it. "It's a fortress you're raising," she said one gray afternoon. She said it almost with admiration. Cora did not break the rhythm of her hands. Trowel, stone, press. The work had its own music by then, and she had learned not to lose it. "I suppose it is," she answered. That was all. But it was enough. More than enough. Because Verena Calder was the only soul in that whole cold valley who did not look at her as a woman come unmoored from her wits. She looked at her, instead, the way a person looks at a general laying out a defense before a battle that has not yet been joined, with respect, with waiting, with the patience of someone who had decided to find out before she decided to scoff. And Cora, who had no one else alive to be seen that way by, found she needed it more than she would ever have confessed to a living person. It is a particular kind of mercy, that. To be believed before you have been proven right. Most people will not give it. They stand well back, with their arms folded, and let you carry the whole weight of the doubt alone, all the long way to the end. And only when the thing is finished and standing will they step forward and tell you, smiling, that they had known it all along. Verena Calder did not wait. She wagered early. She wagered on a woman the whole valley had given up on, with nothing to go on but the look in that woman's eye and the plain, stubborn fact of the work. And Cora would carry that the rest of her days. The work itself fed on her. The land was hungry, and the wall was its appetite, and there was no end to either. Each stone had to be found and freed from the frozen ground, and dragged up the long rise, and lifted, and fitted, and bound. The heavy river rock went into the foundation, where its great rounded weight was a curse to set, and a blessing once it settled, immovable as a verdict handed down. The flatter, layered stone off the broken slope went into the rising faces, lighter in the hand, willing to lie close against its neighbors. She hoisted the worst of it with a small hand winch her late husband had left among his tools. The rope bit into her palms until they bled, and then bit into the healing, and then bit into the scars. Her shoulders burned with a clean, honest pain that, for whole hours at a stretch, crowded out the duller ache she carried lower down, the one with no muscle to it, and no cure either. She mixed her mortar in a shallow pit. Clay and chopped straw and creek water worked together with a hoe until the whole mess dragged at the blade like something half alive. It was crude stuff. No town mason would have praised it. But it gripped. And gripping was the whole of what she asked of it in those long laboring hours when her hands were busy and her mind ran loose and free. She found herself going back, far back, across the years and the long miles, to the hard man who had given her the only weapon she now had against the winter, her father. He had not been an easy man to be daughter to. He had been hard the way the granite he worked was hard, slow to warm, sparing with his praise to a degree that was its own quiet cruelty, though he would have been astonished to hear it called that. He did not gather her up when she was small and frightened. He did not soften the sharp corners of the world for her. He did not tell her, not one single time in all the years she had him, that she was loved. She had grown up hungry for a tenderness that simply was not in him to give, and she had learned, by slow and painful inches, to stop reaching for it. But there was one thing he gave her. One thing he gave no one else. He taught her. He let her trail him through his work when any other man would have shooed a girl child off to mind the house. He set his rough, scarred hand over her small one on the cold stone, and showed her how to read the grain of it, how to feel for the hidden line where the rock wanted to break, how to fit one piece so close against its neighbor that not even the wind off the water could find a way between them. He had no son. There had only ever been her. And a man like that, a man who could not say the soft words, who could not make his love into anything a child could hold in her arms at night. Such a man will pour what he feels into the only vessel he knows how to fill. He had poured himself into the teaching. He had never once told her he loved her, but he had taught her how to keep her children breathing through a winter he never lived to see. And somewhere along the way, she had decided to call those two things the same. The thought did not heal the old wound. It was too old and far too deep for any healing, but it dressed it clean. And she found that she could hold the memory of him now without the resentment that had always come braided through it, like a thread of cold wire. His coldness had reached across all the years and all the miles, and become the very warmth her children would sleep inside of. If the wall held, if she could finish it, if the land did not break her first. The land tried. It tried first through the clay. By the time the work had climbed past her waist, the pit she had been drawing from ran thin, and then ran sandy, and the mortar she mixed from the last of it crumbled at the edge of the trowel and would not bind. She stood over a ruined batch of it one bitter morning, and a cold understanding settled into her that had nothing to do with the weather. Without good clay, the wall would not last out its first hard freeze. The frost would get into the weak joints. It would work them loose. It would do, slowly and patiently, exactly what Garrett Mercer had promised it would do. And the whole brutal labor of the autumn would crumble down into a heap of rubble around a house full of freezing children. There was a better bank of it. She knew where. Far off, down along the river, through ground already stiffening hard toward winter. It would cost her a day she could not afford, and it would cost her the children too, for she could not take them on a haul like that. So she carried them to Verena Calder, and Verena took them in without a single question, which was, in its own quiet way, the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a long time. "Go on," she said. "They'll be here, and they'll be fed, and they'll be loved when you come back for them. Go get your clay." So Cora went. The going out was difficult. The coming back was something close to torture. She dug the clay with hands that had long since stopped feeling the cold. She loaded the barrow heavier than was wise, because she could not bear the thought of making the journey twice. And then she turned for home, into a wind that came straight at her the whole long way, leaning on the load, leaning on her, as though the land itself had taken a personal dislike to her. By the time she could see the dark shape of the wall rising against the failing sky, her arms had gone past trembling and past aching, into something worse, a deadness, a refusal, her body simply, finally done. She got the clay home. She unloaded it in the dark, by feel, and then she sat down in the cold against the wall she had nearly killed herself to keep alive, and for the first time since the night of Etta's fever, she let herself wonder. She let herself wonder whether Garrett Mercer might not simply be right, whether all of them might be right, whether a woman could break her body and her heart against a thing, and be wrong about it the entire time, whether love, even the fiercest love, was any guarantee at all of being right. The wonder did not last out the week, but it was joined, 2 days later, by something far harder to set aside. It happened in the ordinary middle of an ordinary morning. Toby was at his work, his closers, carrying the small flat stones to her one at a time, holding each against his thin chest like something precious. She had told him 100 times to keep his hands clear of the courses she was setting. And he was 6, and he was careful, and he had kept clear 100 times. He did not keep clear once. He was cradling a flat slab against his chest, stepping in close to set it down for her, and his bare hand was caught, for half a single heartbeat, between the stone he carried and the stone already set in the wall. The slab came down across his small fingers. His scream went through her like a blade dropped from a great height. She had his hand free and pressed between both of hers before the sound had even finished leaving his body. The small fingers already darkening. The nail of the middle one split and welling dark. And the sound he was making, the high, broken, terrified sound of a child caught in a pain too big for him to understand, was a sound she knew she would go on hearing in her sleep for a long, long time. She bound the hand with a strip torn from her own petticoat. She held him hard against her and rocked him, and made the low sounds that a mother makes. The sounds that have no words but say, I am here, I have you. The hurt will pass. While inside her, something else entirely was tearing loose, and over his bent and shaking head. She looked at the wall, at the cold gray monument she had raised stone by stone with her own ruined hands. At the thing she had given her whole self to, the thing the valley laughed at, the thing she had sworn on the worst night of her life would be the saving of her children. And for one long, terrible moment, she hated it. She hated what it had already cost her. She hated what it might still cost. And the words rose up in her, unbidden and unwanted, and she had no strength left to push them back down. Perhaps a wall was not worth a single one of his fingers. Perhaps they had the right of it after all, and she was exactly the broken thing they said she was. She came nearer to quitting in that moment than she ever had before. Nearer than she would ever come again. She might have stopped. She might have carried the boy inside and barred the door and let the half-built wall stand there in the yard as a monument to her foolishness. It would have been so easy. That was the terrible part. After everything, quitting would have been the easy thing. A small thing saved her. It was the boy himself. His hand healed, the nail blackened, and in its time lifted away, and a new one began its slow, pale climb beneath. And the boy bore the whole of it, the pain, the binding, the long, tender ache of the healing, with a stillness that shamed her clean out of her own faltering. He did not blame the wall. He never once asked her to stop, And when the hand had mended enough to be of use again, he came and stood at her side at the work, and held up his closers in his good hand, and looked at her with those grave, dark eyes, waiting simply to be let back in. Her son had more faith in her than she had in herself, and she could not be the one to break it. So she went back to the wall, because there was nothing else in all the wide, cold world to go back to. It was while she was clearing out her late husband's old toolbox, hunting for a smaller pry bar, one small enough that a healing boy might safely handle, that she found the letter. It was folded small and wedged beneath a false bottom, in the place where Elias had kept the few things he counted as important. She knew his hand before she had the page even fully open. It was a letter never sent, addressed to a land agent somewhere off in the wider world beyond the valley. And in it, her husband, the man she had buried on the rise to the east, the man she had believed died on some errand whose shape she would never learn, had been asking after claims far away, land with timber, land with running water, land with shelter the good Lord had put there himself, so a man would not have to build it from nothing with his own two hands, because he had written, in his cramped and careful script, "This place cannot be wintered, and I will not stand by and watch my family try." Cora sat back on her heels in the cold and silent cabin, with the page trembling faintly in her two hands, and felt the ground she had stood on for 2 long years tilt, slowly, under her. Elias had known. He had looked at the same wind, and the same thin walls, and the same merciless gray sky that she looked at every single day. And he had come to the exact opposite conclusion. He had decided that the only sane answer, the only loving answer, was to leave, to run, to carry them all clear of this killing ground before it took one of them for good, and he had been on his way to arrange it. That was the errand. That was the road he had ridden out on. The raw morning the cold caught him and would not let him go. He had not died for nothing. He had died trying to carry his family to safety, away from the very thing she was now breaking her body and her heart to stand and fight. He had meant to run from it. She meant to stand and beat it. And God help her, she could not say which one of them was the fool. The doubt that put in her ran deeper than any weariness, deeper than any crushed small hand could ever reach. Because it was no longer just the valley she was setting herself against. It was him, the man she had loved, the father of her sleeping children. His own sober, careful, loving reckoning of this ground, written down in his own hand and hidden away in a place she was never meant to find. She read it again by the gray light. She read it a 3rd time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something easier. They did not. They only sat there, plain and patient, telling her the same hard thing every time. He must have lain awake, too, she thought, the night he wrote it. He must have looked at his sleeping children and felt the same cold fist close around his heart. He had made his choice out of that fear, and it had been a brave choice, and a good one, and it had gotten him killed on a frozen road. She did not resolve it that night. She folded the letter along its worn creases. She put it back in the place he had hidden it. and she carried the not knowing out to the wall with her the next morning, and set stone with it, lying heavy as wet clay in her chest, because the only other choice was to sit inside and let the doubt take the whole of the day. And that she would not give it. The wall cared nothing for what Elias had believed. It knew only whether it would stand, whether the still air it cradled in its dark hollow would do the silent work her father had promised. And those questions would never be answered by a letter, or by the valley, or by a good man's good intentions. They would be answered by the winter, and by nothing else under heaven. There was a thing about Garrett Mercer's disapproval that had puzzled her from the very start. It was not the scorn. She had expected scorn, and scorn was easy enough to carry, once you got the trick of it. It was the fury underneath the scorn, the strange heat of it, the way a man she had barely exchanged a dozen words with had ridden up her road on purpose, just to stand in her cold yard and tell her she was wrong, as though her wall were somehow a thing being done to him personally. The puzzle did not come apart until his wife handed her one corner of the truth. Della Mercer came alone one gray morning. She said she had come to return a borrowed pail, but she lingered far longer than any borrowed pail could ever explain. Her eyes traveled again and again to the wall, and to the dark hollow behind it, and to the woman who was building both. She had the look of someone working up to a thing, turning it over, deciding whether to set it down or carry it home again, unspoken. When at last she spoke, it was scarcely above the reach of the wind. "Garrett isn't a hard man. At the bottom of him." Cora waited. There was more coming. She could feel the weight of it in the air between them. "We lost a boy. Our first." Della's hands worked the fringe of her shawl around and around, the way hands do when the mouth is saying a thing the heart can barely stand to say. It was years back, before ever we came out to this valley, in a cabin no better chinked than yours is now. He went a breath, a long one. He went the way a small child goes, when the cold takes a grip of them and won't be made to let go. The wind moved between the two women, and neither of them spoke into it. Garrett sat up with him, every night, right to the end, wouldn't leave the bedside, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't be moved. And when it was over, it changed the shape of the man for good. He's never been quite the same since, though he would lie down and die before he'd ever say so out loud. Della finally lifted her eyes to Cora's face, and there was something raw in them now, something stripped down to the bone. "So when he sees you out here, Mrs. Hale, laying a wager against the winter, with your two little ones so small, it isn't your good sense he's doubting. A beat. It's that he cannot stand to watch and do nothing, and have it go wrong a second time." Then she took up her empty pail, and she went, and Cora stood alone in the cold yard, holding what she had been handed, and the hard frozen thing behind her ribs shifted and made room for something far more tangled than anger. He was not fighting her. He was fighting a grave he had dug a long time ago, a grave he had never once managed to fill back in. The knowledge changed nothing about the work. The stones still had to be lifted. The mortar still had to be mixed. But it changed the weight of his disapproval entirely. And she found, after that morning, that she could carry it differently. The way a heavy load rides easier on the back, once you finally know what's been packed inside it. She had thought herself alone in her grief. She was learning, slowly, that the whole valley was full of grief, that behind every closed door, behind every shaking head and every set, certain jaw, someone was carrying a thing they could not put down. The cold did that to people. It took, and the ones it left standing learned to look away from each other's wounds, because there was no end to them, and no fixing them, and a body can only hold so much before it has to look away simply to keep standing. But not everyone looked away. She learned that too, and she learned it in the dark. It was deep in a bitter night, the children long asleep, when a sound at the far side of the wall pulled her up out of a thin and troubled rest. A careful scraping, a small, wet drag, a sound she could not place and did not like at all, out there in the freezing dark where no honest thing had any business being. She rose. She wrapped her shawl close over the lamp to shield its light down to almost nothing, and she went out into the cold to see what was at her wall. What she found stopped her where she stood. It was Della Mercer, her sleeves shoved up past the elbow, her forearms grayed to the wrist with mortar, working a fresh course of stone into its bed, in the freezing dark, by feel alone, because she could risk a light no more than Cora could ever risk being seen to need her help. The woman went still in the sudden shielded lamplight, caught like a thief at a window, and then she straightened, slowly, and she met Cora's eyes with a defiance that had plainly cost her a great deal to carry all the way across the dark and frozen valley at such an hour. Garrett would skin me raw, if ever he knew. Her voice came low and quick. But I buried a boy to the winter once, and I will not stand and watch it reach its cold hand toward yours, when there is a thing I can do about it, with my own too. Cora looked at her, at the mortar drying gray on her bare arms in the cold, at the fear and the resolve fighting it out over the same tired, brave face. And something passed between the two of them, there in the dark, that needed no further words at all to carry it. A grief, recognizing a grief. A mother, standing with a mother. She did not send Della home. She could not have, even if she had tried. She found the woman a second trowel instead, and the two of them worked on, side by side, in the freezing dark, under a lamp shawled down to a thread of glow. Two women who had each buried something to the cold, or stood ready to, both of them refusing, with everything they had, to let the winter take one more child. After that night, Della came whenever she could slip free, never for long, never in the daylight, never spoken of where another soul might hear. She would appear out of the dark with her sleeves already pushing up, and work an hour or two at Cora's side, and slip away again before the gray came up in the east, leaving the wall a little higher than the cold had any right to expect of one lone woman. And the wall climbed faster, for the help of her two hands. But it was never the speed of it that mattered most. It was the company. For the first time since Elias had gone down into the cold ground, Cora was not carrying the whole crushing weight of the doubt entirely alone. There was another set of hands in the dark beside her own. Another woman who knew, in her bones and in her buried grief, the precise and terrible shape of the thing they were fighting together. The valley had decided she was alone. The valley was wrong. Beneath all the shaking heads and the talk that died when she walked into a room, it held at least one woman brave enough to defy her own husband in the freezing dark, out of a love that simply could not bear to watch the same thing happen twice. And a widow on her own claim, who had believed before there was a single thing to believe in, and the two small ones inside the drafty house, who loved their mother too simply ever to imagine she could be wrong. It was not much when you laid it all out, but it was not nothing, and on the very hardest nights, it was just exactly enough. Once, in a lull, with a course of mortar setting and the lamp shawled low between them, Della spoke quietly into the dark. "You ever wonder," she said, "why the rest of them won't even look at it? Won't even ask you a plain question? They'd sooner call you mad than stop and wonder." Cora considered it a while, her trowel resting. "Because asking is dangerous," she said at last. "If they ask, and the answer turns out to make sense, then they'd have to wonder why they never thought of it themselves. And it is a great deal easier to call a woman mad than to wonder a thing like that about your own self." Della was quiet a moment, turning that over. "He's not a bad man, my Garrett," she said, softer this time, as if the saying of it held something together. "I know it," Cora said, and meant it. "He just can't abide the not knowing. He has to be sure of a thing. It's how he gets himself through the day. And you went and built him a thing he can't be sure about, right there at the edge of his own road, where he's got to ride past it every single day and not understand a stone of it." Cora almost smiled, there in the cold dark. "I didn't build it for him." "I know that," Della said, "but he doesn't. That's the whole of his trouble with it." And the two of them bent back to the stone and said no more, and let the work speak the rest. The wall was nearly finished by then. She could see the end of it at last. The two faces had risen and met. The courses had climbed to where she had always meant for them to climb. Only the topmost work remained now, and the small screened openings her father had taught her never, ever to forget. The little vents at the crown and at the foot of the dark hollow, so that the damp trapped inside could climb its way out, without ever once letting a draft climb in. She set them with great care. She heard his voice as she did it, low and grinding, rising up out of the years. "Mind the breathing of it, girl. Seal it up tight to hold every scrap of warmth, and you'll only trap the wet along with it, and the wet will eat your good logs from the inside out while you lie there sleeping. Leave it room to breathe, and it will keep its peace 100 years." She left it room to breathe. And then, on one cold gray afternoon, with the children playing safe in the still margin of air the wall now cradled at her back, she set the last stone. She stood back from it. It was no thing of beauty. It rose rough and heavy and mismatched, a brutish gray shell of fitted rock, so that the small house crouching inside it looked less like a home than like something half buried, something the land itself had decided to swallow down, and only half finished the job. It was the ugliest thing she had ever made with her two hands, and she loved it the way you can only love a thing you have very nearly died building. She laid her cracked and ruined palm flat against the cold outer stone, and she felt the whole long labor of it move under her hand. Every load she had dragged up bleeding from the creek, every night of doubt, the crushed small hand, the dead man's letter, the whole cold valley shaking its head, all of it, in the stone. It was finished. The shield was raised. The blanket of still air lay waiting in the dark hollow behind it, exactly as a hard man had promised. A small girl it would, a lifetime ago, on a far stony coast she would never see again. And the two small lives the whole thing had been built to keep were warm and safe and sleeping inside. And out beyond it, far out over the open land where the wind itself was born, the wide gray sky had begun, very quietly, to change. She felt it before she ever saw it. A heaviness coming into the air, a stillness that pressed against the inner ear. The birds had gone quiet first, and then the birds had simply gone, lifting away toward shelter she could not see. The light had thinned and flattened into a single gray ceiling, drawn taut as a drumhead across the whole reach of the visible world. She stood in her finished yard, with her ruined hand resting on her finished wall, and she looked out at that changing sky, and she knew. It was coming. Everything she had bled for. Everything she had been laughed at for. Everything she had set herself against. Her neighbors, her own bone-deep exhaustion, her son's small hand, her dead husband's careful and loving judgment. All of it was about to be answered. Not by argument, not by belief, by the winter itself, coming down at last off the open land to tell her whether she had been the one soul in the whole valley who saw the thing true, or whether she had spent everything she had raising a great gray monument to her own madness. She gathered her children in from the cold. She barred the door, not against any man, but against the air itself and the thing it was carrying toward her on its back. And she stood in the middle of her small, still house with a child pressed warm against each side of her, and waited for the cold to come and tell her which. The first flakes did not drift. They were flung sideways, hard, on a wind that climbed from a low murmur to a high shriek inside the space of a single hour. And then kept climbing, past anything the valley had a name for, until the whole world outside the small house was nothing but a roaring white blindness with no edge anywhere in it. The storm struck the homestead like a flat hand laid against the side of a man's head. In the winters before this one, this was the hour the cabin would have begun its surrender. The hour the wind always found the shrunken seams and poured through them in thin, icy jets that crossed the room like blades. The hour the lamp leaned and shuddered. The hour the stove roared its heart up the flue and gave it all to the sky, while the very walls began to give off a deep, penetrating chill that no fire built by mortal hands could answer. This was the hour the cold used to move in. Cora stood in the middle of the small room, with a child pressed warm against each side of her, and she waited for it. She waited for the first cold finger of draft on the back of her neck. She waited for the lamp to lean. She waited for the long, sleepless, losing night to begin. She braced for the siege she knew by heart, and the siege did not come. The first thing to tell her was the sound. The wind was not shrieking at her seams. It was not finding its way in. There were no thin whistling jets, no spiteful drafts threading through the room. There was only a deep, muffled roar, somehow distant even as it raged not 10 feet from where she stood. The sound of a great battle being fought by someone else entirely, somewhere far away, behind a closed and bolted door. She crossed to the lamp on the table, half expecting it to lie to her, half expecting the flame to lean and gutter the moment she dared to trust it. It burned straight up, steady as a thing cast in brass, its small light unwavering, and Cora stood over it a long while with her arms wrapped around herself, hardly daring to believe that the air inside her own house had simply gone still. The children felt the change before they could have named it, the way animals feel a shift in the weight of the sky. Etta, who in every winter before this one had wept at the howling and burrowed sobbing into her mother's side. Etta sat on the rug near the wall with her one cloth doll, building some small private kingdom out of the strange new quiet. And after a time, she lay down right where she sat, and she slept, her round cheek flat against the floorboards, in a spot that the winter before had been a vein of pure, crawling cold, a place where no child could have lasted 10 minutes without shaking. Cora stood over her sleeping daughter and felt her throat draw tight. That the child could sleep there was the only proof she would ever need, and it was worth every last stone she had carried. Toby sat near the stove, his healed hand resting quiet in his lap. He watched his little sister sleep on the floor that should have frozen her. Then he looked up at his mother, with a question in his grave dark eyes that he was too proud to put into words. Cora crouched down to him. She pressed her brow to his, and she let him understand from her face alone the thing she had no words good enough to say, that they were safe, that the thing pounding the walls could not get in, that for once in his short, hard little life, the winter had been told no, and had been made to mind it. She fed the stove through that first night, but she fed it sparingly, watching, testing her own disbelief against the slow, honest burn of the splits. And by the gray of morning, she had used less than half of what any other storm of that violence would have devoured whole. The heat she made stayed inside, banked and held by the still air in the dark hollow beyond the logs, hoarded like a thing of value, instead of flung up the chimney to be lost in the screaming dark. She sat that night in the rocker that had come down to her, mending the torn knee of Toby's spare trousers by the steady lamplight, and she listened to the muffled fury beyond the stone, and she listened to the small, even breathing of her 2 children inside it, and the 2 sounds, laid together, made a kind of music she had never once expected to hear in that place. She was not fighting the cold tonight, she understood. The needle paused in the cloth. She was only keeping house, the way a woman is meant to, while the storm wore itself down to nothing against her father's good sense. It was the first night since Elias went into the ground that she did not lie awake bargaining with the weather, and when at last she let herself sleep, she slept hard. The storm did not pass in a single night. It settled over the whole country, and it stayed. A churning chaos of white that erased the road and the line of the far horizon, and the very difference between the earth and the sky. To look from the small window was to look into a roaring blankness with no edge to it anywhere. For days, the world beyond the wall simply ceased to be a place a person could go. And inside the wall, a strange, unhurried peace took up residence in place of the old terror. She rationed the wood out of habit, more than need. She baked a flat, hard bread on the stovetop. She told the children the stories her father had told her, of the rocky coast where he had learned his trade, of the strange sheds he built that kept things dry and good, while other men's spoiled, of the secret hollow of still air running between the wood and the stone. Toby wanted that Shed described to him every single evening, and she described it again and again, and watched him come to understand by slow degrees that the strange thing his mother had built in the cold was no madness at all. It was an inheritance, a piece of his grandfather's knowing, carried a very long way, in his mother's two ruined hands. It might have ended there, a hard storm weathered, a strange wall proven, a family kept warm while the world howled outside. It might have been that simple. But the winter was not finished with her yet. On the deepest night of the storm, when the wind had become a single constant pressure against the stone, a weight that never lifted and never paused, Cora woke from her hard sleep with the sense that something was wrong. She could not say what at first. It was a feeling before it was a fact. The way a mother wakes in the dark a half-breath before her child cries out. Some old animal part of her had come awake and was pulling at her, hard, telling her to rise. She rose. The lamp had burned low. The stove still glowed. The children slept. Everything looked as it should. And yet, she stood in the middle of the room, and she made herself go still. And she made herself listen. Not to the storm, but to the house, to the small sounds underneath the great one. And then she understood. The fire was wrong. The stove was not drawing the way it should. The flame inside it had gone low and sullen and orange where it ought to have burned clean. And there was a smell in the room, faint, bitter. A thin gray haze beginning to gather up near the ceiling where the lamplight caught it and turned it to a slow drifting smoke. The smoke was not going up the flue. It was coming back down. It was coming back into the room. And in the same cold instant that she understood it, she understood why. The vents, the little screened openings at the crown of the hollow. The ones her father had taught her never to forget. The breathing of the wall. Out there, all through the long days of the storm, the wind had been driving snow against the high stone without rest, packing it and freezing it hard into the small openings until the wall could no longer breathe. And a wall that cannot breathe cannot draw. A fire must breathe, the same as a child must. And she had sealed the house so tight against the wind that the only breath it had left came in low through the vents at the foot of the wall and out the small mouths at the crown. The wall breathed for the whole house, and the fire breathed through the wall. Choke those high openings, and the fire began to smother in its own smoke. And what it could not send up the flue, it sent back down into the room. Etta coughed in her sleep, a small sound, a wet, tight little sound, in the dark. And it went through Cora, like ice water poured straight down her spine, because she knew that sound. She had heard it before, on the worst night of her life, with a fevered child burning in her arms. It was the sound of a small chest that could not get what it needed. Toby stirred, coughed, did not wake. The haze near the ceiling was thickening, and Cora Hale stood in the middle of her warm, still, beautiful house, the house she had nearly died building, and understood, with a clarity that stopped her heart, that the thing she had made to save her children was now very quietly trying to take them. There was only one way to stop it. The vents had to be cleared, from the outside, now, tonight, in the storm. She did not let herself think about it. Thinking would have stopped her, and there was no time to be stopped. She dragged the children's bedding to the floor by the door, low, where the air was still clean. She pressed a damp cloth to each small sleeping face. She banked the stove down low, to cut the smoke as far as she dared without losing the fire she would need to come back to. Then she pulled on her late husband's old coat, and his boots, and she wound a scarf tight across her nose and her mouth, and she set her hand on the bar of the door. She stood there one moment, just one, listening to the monster on the other side of it. The wind was a living thing out there. She could feel it pressing against the wood, leaning its whole weight against the door, against the house, against everything she loved. To open that door was to let it in. To step out into it was to step into a thing that killed grown men who lost their way between the barn and the house. She thought of Elias. She thought of a frozen road and a good man who had gone out into the cold and never come back. And then she thought of Etta's cough, and she lifted the bar. The storm took the door out of her hands. It slammed back, and the cold came in like something alive and starving, and the lamp behind her went out at once, and the snow came with it, into her face, into her eyes, blinding, burning, everywhere, all at once. She forced herself out. She dragged the door shut behind her against the screaming wind, sealing the children back into the dark. And then she was alone in it. There was no up, and no down, and no near, and no far. There was only white and roar, and a cold so total that it was not even a feeling anymore. It was a pressure, a force, a hand closing over her whole body at once and squeezing. The wall. She had to find the wall. She put out her hands and she found the cold stone of it, and she pressed herself against it, and she held on to it the way a drowning soul holds to the one solid thing in a flood. The wall. Her wall. The thing she had built. It would guide her. She had only to follow it, around to the high side, to the place where the vents were choked, and clear them, and follow it back. That was all. That was everything. She began to move, hand over hand along the rough, cold stone, her face turned away from the worst of it, the wind shoving at her back, then her side, then her face, changing without warning, trying to peel her loose and carry her off into the white where there was nothing. The cold went into her hands first. She had pulled the scarf from her face to free her breath, and her hands she could no longer wrap, because she needed the bare fingers for what came next. And so she gave them to the cold, and the cold took them gladly. She reached the high side of the wall. She reached up, blind, feeling along the crown of the stone for the small screened openings. And she found the first one, and her numb fingers told her what her eyes could not see. It was packed solid, a hard plug of driven snow and ice frozen into the screen, sealing it shut. The breath of the house stopped up like a fist in a throat. She began to claw at it with her bare hands, with her frozen fingers that could barely feel the stone, let alone the ice. She dug, and she scraped, and she pulled, and the ice tore at her skin, and she did not feel it, and the wind tried to throw her down, and she leaned into the wall and would not be thrown. Clear it, clear it, clear it. She broke the first plug loose and felt the dark hollow behind it draw a breath at last. A small cold sigh of moving air against her ruined hand. One done. She dragged herself along to the next, and cleared it, and the next. Her hands had stopped being hands. They were tools now, blunt and bleeding and far away, doing the work because she told them to, and for no other reason. The storm screamed at her. It told her, in a voice older than the valley, older than her father, older than anything, that she did not belong out here, that no one did, that this was its country, and she was nothing in it, and it could end her between one breath and the next, and the white would close over the place where she had been, as if she had never lived at all. She cleared the last vent, and she turned to go back, and the wall was gone. Not gone. She knew it was not gone. But her hands found nothing. She had turned and lost it, and the white had closed in on every side, and there was no stone anywhere, only the roar, and the blindness, and the cold pressing in. This was how it happened. This was how it had happened to Elias. A man steps out, sure of his way. He turns. The world goes white, and the line between safe and lost simply vanishes. And he wanders the wrong way. 2 steps, 10, and the cold takes him within sight of his own door, and no one ever knows how close he came. The thought should have frozen her. It did the opposite, because she was not Elias, and this was not a frozen road, and she had built the very thing she was looking for with her own 2 hands. She knew this wall. She knew its every stone. She had carried each one up from the creek and set it with her own ruined fingers, and her body knew the shape of it the way it knew the faces of her children. She made herself stop. She made herself still in the heart of the roaring white, and she did not flail, and she did not run. She turned slow, and she reached out low, where she had been working, and her hand found the stone, the wall. She pressed herself to it, sobbing now, the breath tearing in her chest, and she did not let go of it again. Hand over hand, slow, sure, the wind shoving, the cold biting, the white screaming that she would never make it. She made it. Her hand found the door frame, the latch, the bar. She fell through into the dark, warm house and dragged the door shut behind her and put her back against it and slid down it to the floor. And for a long moment she could do nothing at all but shake. The smoke was clearing. She could see it, even in the dark, the gray haze thinning, lifting, drawn up and out now that the wall could breathe again. The fire in the stove had caught and steadied. The draft had returned. The house was pulling its own breath once more. She crawled to the children. She put her frozen, bleeding hand to each small face and felt the warm breath against her ruined fingers and heard the small chests rise and fall, clean and easy now, the wet, tight cough gone out of them. They had not even woken. They had slept through the whole of it, through their mother's war in the dark, through the moment the wall nearly killed them, and the moment she nearly died, saving them from it. They slept on, warm and certain, in a house that held. And Cora Hale lay down on the floor between her two children and pressed her broken hands against her own chest to thaw them, and wept, silently, so as not to wake them. Not from fear now, but from something far larger than fear, something that had no name, she knew. She had built a thing, and the thing had turned on her, and she had gone out into the dark and the killing cold, and she had fought it, hand to hand, and she had won. She did not sleep again that night. She sat up against the wall, watching the steady fire, watching the small sleeping faces, listening to the storm rage on outside against a house that breathed once more. And she tended it. When the wind finally broke, it broke into a silence so complete that the sudden absence of sound woke her more surely than any noise ever could have. She lay still a moment, listening to nothing at all. Then she rose and went to the door, and had to set her whole shoulder against it, for the snow had drifted high through the night, and the swollen wood did not want to give. It gave at last, with a groan, and the light that poured through the gap was so fierce, so reflected and multiplied off the sculpted white waste beyond, that she had to shield her eyes against the sight of her own dooryard. The world had been remade while she slept. Drifts curled like frozen surf against the outer wall. The far trees stood sheathed in white to the last twig, and the open land ran unbroken and blinding to a horizon that had reappeared overnight, clean and silent and savagely, terribly lovely, as though the storm had scoured the whole country down to something very near to holy. She pulled the coat close and stepped out into air so cold it cut at the back of her throat, but air that was, at last, utterly still. The wind that had carried the cold for days had finally laid itself down to rest. She walked the edge of her work, and she did the one thing she had promised herself she would let herself do when the storm was done. The test, the proof, the thing that would settle the whole matter past any further argument any soul could ever raise. She laid her bare palm flat against the outer stone of the high wall. It was brutally cold. Breathtakingly cold. Colder than the iron latch of the door. Cold enough that her skin caught at it, and she had to pull away, and the frost stood thick as white fur in the crevices of the mortar. The stone had become exactly as Garrett Mercer had sworn to her face that it would, a thing colder than any grave a man could dig in the dead of the year. He had been right about the stone, entirely, completely right. Then she stepped into the narrow hollow, into the dark margin between the wall and the cabin, into her father's blanket of trapped and guarded air, and she laid the very same hand against the log wall of her home. And it was cool, only cool, neutral as a stone that has sat all day in the shade, neither giving off cold nor stealing warmth, holding the line precisely where it had been told to hold it, the killing cold of the outer stone, not one hand's breadth away. And here, behind the still air, nothing. Peace. The quiet refusal of a thing that simply would not let the cold across. The wind had made the rock a weapon, and the rock had made the wind nothing. And the still air between them had done the only thing that ever truly mattered in all the world, which is to keep its peace. She stood there a long while, looking at the two walls, and at the invisible third thing she had built between them, the thing no one could see, the thing that had cost her everything, and she let herself feel, at last, in full, the fierce and whole weight of having been right. The pride that filled her then carried no warmth from any stove in it. It was the deeper heat of a thing trusted and proven, of knowledge held fast against the doubt of an entire valley, of her own ruined hands held up against the pity of every neighbor who had ever slowed a wagon to gawk at her labor and shake his head. She had not built the wall to be admired. She had built it to keep two small lives up out of the frozen ground, and the measure of her success was not to be found in any applause. It was to be found in the plain, unremarkable fact of her children's untroubled sleep, in the rain barrel that bore only a thick cap of ice over water still liquid beneath, in the woodpile that had barely shrunk, while the whole country beyond her wall had spent days laboring to freeze her family into the earth, and failing at it. Success, she thought, is the absence of a funeral, and no living soul has ever thrown a celebration for a grave that went undug. She turned back toward the cabin, toward the smoke rising straight and untroubled from her chimney into the windless morning sky. And it was then, lifting her eyes from the smoke to the white waste beyond it, that she saw it, a figure, far out across the drifts, a dark shape struggling and small against all that blinding white, laboring toward the homestead, breaking each step through the hard crust with a visible, terrible effort, coming on slow, coming on bent, coming on like a soul half beaten by the very cold she had just defeated. She shaded her eyes against the glare, and she watched it come, and though she could not yet make out the face beneath the hat, she knew the set of those broad, weathered shoulders. It was Garrett Mercer, coming back to her door, and as she stood there in the savage white silence, her bleeding hand still cold from the proof of the stone, she understood that he was not coming to repeat his sermon. No man crossed that frozen waste in the wake of that storm to repeat a sermon. Something had happened to him out there in the dark days. Something had broken, or fallen, or failed. And he was coming to her. The strange widow, the mad woman of the valley, the one he had pitied, for a reason she could not yet guess. She did not go inside. She stood in the doorway of her warm and breathing house, with the smoke rising straight behind her, and she watched the man who had doubted her fight his way, step by labored step, across the proof of how wrong he had been. And she waited for him to arrive. He reached the wall and put out a hand to it without seeming to know what it was. He leaned there a moment, hanging on the cold stone, dragging the freezing air down into his lungs in great, ragged plumes. And when at last he lifted his head and found her standing in the doorway of her warm house, his face was gray with exhaustion and grim with something that weighed far more than the cold. The words came out of him in pieces, between hard breaths. Mrs. Hale. A pause, a swallow. The wind took the sod clean off my foundation that first night, tore it away like it had never been laid down at all. He looked past her, into the dim, warm interior, then back to her face. A drift came down on the woodshed, stove the whole roof in. I lost the better half of my winter's wood under all of it. Everything I'd cut and split since the leaves turned. His jaw worked against itself. I came to see where you and the little ones. He did not finish it. He could not. But he did not have to. Because she could read the whole of it, plain as print, across that ruined, exhausted face. He had come to find a scene of misery. He had come expecting frozen children and a desperate widow and a house losing its long war against the cold. He had come to do for her, the strange, mad widow, the very thing he had been unable to do for his own small boy all those years ago, in a cabin no better than the one he thought he would find here. He had come to be a rescuer, and he had crossed that whole killing waste of snow to do it. She stepped aside from the door, and she held it open. "Come in out of it, Mr. Mercer," she said. "There's broth on the stove." He hesitated on the threshold, and she watched the hesitation and understood it for exactly what it was. It was the reluctance of a man to step inside a house he had come to pity, only to discover, somehow, that it did not need his pity at all. Then he stomped the snow from his boots against the jamb, and he ducked his head, and he came inside. The change took hold of him the very instant he was through the door. He stopped dead, 2 steps in, the way a man stops short when the floor he expected to be there is not where his foot comes down. He turned his head, slow, taking the measure of the room, the small, steady fire, the lamp still burning, forgotten, in full daylight. Toby at the table, Etta on the rug with her cloth doll, both of them rosy, both of them warm, neither of them showing the pinched and bluish look of children who have spent days fighting the cold for the right to draw each breath. But it was not what he saw that undid him. It was what he failed to feel. He stood there in the middle of her small, quiet house, and he waited for the drafts, for the cold fingers sliding across the back of his neck, for the deep, radiating chill of walls that had stood days inside a storm, for the close, miserable damp of a place slowly losing. And not one of those things came near him. The cabin was not hot. It was something stranger and far more complete than warmth. It was still. The air simply lay there, undisturbed, holding what little heat the small stove gave it, the way cupped hands hold water. And Garrett Mercer, who had built the entire structure of his hard life on the bedrock principle that a man can always trust the plain report of his own 2 senses, stood in a room where his senses were telling him a thing he had sworn to her very face was impossible. He crossed to the wall, the high wall, the one that had taken the full force of the storm for days without flinching, and he laid his bare hand flat against the logs, the very same way she had laid hers that morning, though he could not have known it. She watched his face as he felt it. She watched the exact moment the cool, neutral wood told him the truth that no argument of hers could ever have driven home. The truth she had tried to give him once in this very yard, and that he had thrown back at her like a stone she had called bread. He looked at his own hand, pressed flat to the timber. He looked at her. He opened his mouth and found nothing in it, and closed it again. The whole solid edifice of everything he knew about cold and stone and how a body keeps itself alive on hard ground had taken a blow square at its foundation. And he was a man far too honest with himself to pretend that it had not. She ladled broth from the pot and brought it to him in a tin mug, and he took it in both his big, weathered hands. Like a man glad of something solid to hold on to, he drank, his eyes still moving over the room, still trying and failing to fit the impossible warm thing into the place where his certainty had stood for so long. And the warmth of the broth spread visibly through him, easing the gray out of his face by slow degrees, until he looked less like a man half killed by the cold, and more like a man simply, deeply tired. He stood there in the center of her home a full minute without a word, a long silence for a man who had never, ever, in her experience, been short of them. Then he lowered the mug, and he looked at her directly. And what stood in his face was not the easy contempt he had carried up her road all those weeks before. It was a deep, grudging respect, drawn out of him against his own will, which is the very hardest kind there is to give. Well, his voice came low, weighted down with the labor of the admission. I'll be damned, Mrs. Hale. A breath. You were right. He stopped. He searched for the rest of it, and she let him search, knowing he had to find it himself, or it would mean nothing at all in the end. He found it. The air. He pressed his palm flatter against the logs, as if to make certain one more time. It's still 3 plain words. And they were worth more to her than any apology dressed up in fine cloth could ever have been, because they were not an apology. They were the surrender of a hard and practical man to a thing he had finally been made to feel with his own cold hand in his own bones. He had spent years certain the winter could not be beaten, and now she had shown him a house where it had been. And in doing it, she had given him a far harder kindness than the one he had come all this way meaning to do for her. He did not stay long. He had a wife waiting on him, and a stove-in woodshed, and only half a winter's wood to see them through what was left of the cold. But before he went, he turned at the door, the empty mug still in his hand, as though he had forgotten he was holding it. My Della. He stopped, and a strange expression crossed his weathered face. Suspicion, arriving late and unwelcome. She's been gone of an evening, here and there, this past month. Told me she was sitting with you. His eyes searched hers. Was she? It was not quite a question, and Cora held his gaze, and she did not lie, because she would not hand over Della's courage to be named a shameful thing. She came, she said, more than the once. She mixed mortar with her own 2 hands, in the dark, so her neighbor would have a wall standing before the snow came. She watched the words land on him. She watched him understand that his wife had defied him in the night, out of a grief he had carried for years, believing it was his alone to bear. And the suspicion in his face did not harden into anger. It cracked open into something far rawer than anger, something that looked, for one unguarded moment, almost like a wound being touched. He looked down at the empty mug in his hands. He nodded once, slowly, and he went out into the white without another word. And Cora stood in the doorway and watched him break his slow way back toward home. A man carrying a great deal more than he had brought up the road with him. What came of that night, she learned only later. And it was not anger in the Mercer house. It was a long silence between a husband and a wife, a silence that finally broke. Della would tell her, some weeks on, into the first honest talk the 2 of them had managed in all their years together, about the boy they had buried. The first one, the one Garrett had sat up with, every night, clear to the end. He had never once spoken the child's name aloud in all the long years since the burying, not once. He had locked it away, the way he locked everything away, behind that wall of hard certainty. He spoke it that night. He said his son's name out loud, in the dark, to the only other soul on earth who had loved that small boy as much as he had. And Della said that something came loose in him when he did, something that had been frozen solid for longer than she could rightly remember. The 2 of them wept, she said, together, for the first time. Not over the wall, and not over the winter, but over the small grave that had stood unspoken between them for so long that they had nearly forgotten how to reach across it. The wall had done more than keep the cold out of one house. It had reached into another, and it had let a frozen thing inside a grieving man finally come loose and thaw. She had built a shield against the wind. She had not known she was building anything else, but that, it seemed, was the way of true things. They never stayed put. They were never only the one thing you made them. They went out into the world on their own and did work you never set them to do, in places you would never see. The knowledge began to travel that spring. It had started moving, in truth, while the storm was still raging. Verena Calder came riding over on the second clear day, with a look on her face that was very near to mischief, and she would not say what had brought it until she had tied her horse and stood square in front of the wall and made Cora stop and listen. "I want you to hear it from me first," Verena said, "before it reaches you, bent crooked through other mouths." Cora waited, while that storm was still blowing, before any living soul knew whether your wall would hold or bury the whole lot of you. I sat down at my own table, and I drew it out, the 2 walls, the gap between them, the little vents, top and foot, the whole of it, the way you described it to me, the day I called it a fortress. Verena's chin came up a notch, and the moment the road cleared, I sent copies of it on, to families I knew were struggling, with a note that said, "Here is a thing a widow over the way has done, and it may be worth your trouble to look hard at it." She held Cora's startled eyes without a flinch. "I believed in it before I had any right to. I wagered on you with other folks' winters, and I would do it all over again tomorrow." Cora stood with that a moment. The sheer audacity of it, the faith it had taken. "You might have sent good families to ruin," she said, "had I been wrong." But there was no reproach in it, only wonder. "You weren't wrong," Verena said, plain as that. "I knew it the way you know a roof will hold, before you've ever stood under it in the rain. Some things a person can see the truth of, right from the ground up." She had believed before the proof, Cora thought. Garrett had needed days of storm and a stove-in woodshed to come round to it. Verena had needed nothing at all but the thing laid out plain on a kitchen table. There were two kinds of people walking through this world, and she had been blessed, past her deserving, to know one of each. The families who had received Verena's copies came, in their own time, to see the wall with their own eyes. A lean, quiet couple from a claim off to the north, the Halversons. They had not had time to raise the full stone shell before the snow caught them, but on the strength of a single sheet of paper, they had doubled their hardest wall and packed the gap between with dry slough grass. And they had wintered warmer than they ever had in that house. They came to say thank you, and the woman pressed a round of hard yellow cheese into Cora's hands, wrapped in cloth, and the giving of it said more than any speech could have. The Caseys came a week behind them, from a sod house off to the southwest, and their question was a different one. The old man wanted to know whether the principal would answer for a house of sod as well as one of logs, for he had no timber and no money to buy any. She crouched and considered it honestly before she gave him her answer, because she would not sell a man a certainty she did not own. "The principal cares nothing for the stuff you build it out of," she said at last. "It cares only that there's a still gap, and a windbreak standing on the weather side, and a way left for the damp to climb out before it sours. Sod, or log, or stone, the air does the same work in the gap, for the air does not know, and does not care, what holds it." The old man chewed on that, and then he grinned, and he went home, and packed the cavity of a doubled sod wall with sawdust hauled from the mill. And word came back, before the spring was old, that the Caseys were burning half the wood they had burned the winter before, and that the old man had taken to calling the still air in his walls his finest coat, the one that had not cost him a single cent. It did something complicated to her, all of it, to know that a thing she had built alone, in the cold, while the whole valley shook its head, was now moving out across the country without her, copied in other hands, tested in houses she would never set foot inside. There was pride in it. But there was something gentler, too, the strange, light feeling of a thing leaving your keeping, and being glad to see it go. She thought of her father, who had never hoarded a single thing he knew, who had let any soul on that bitter coast stand and watch him work, and carry away whatever they could hold in their heads, because he had told her once, in his low, grinding voice, that a thing you know is worth nothing at all to keep, unless it can be given away whole. She had taken the knowledge from him as a gift, freely made. It seemed only right then that it should leave her hands the very same way it had come into them. Garrett Mercer came back to her door in the spring. The snow was long gone by then, the ground soft and dark and smelling of thaw. He came without his wagon and without Della, a single rider on a mud-spattered horse, and he came slow, in the manner of a man who has turned a thing over in his mind all the long winter, and is still not entirely sure how to begin saying it. He drew rein at her gate, and he took off his hat, and he held it in both his hands, the way a man holds a hat at a graveside, or before a thing he is half afraid to ask for. He did not ask her to build him a wall. That was the thing she would remember longest about the moment. A lesser man, a man only beaten by the proof and nothing more, would have come asking her to do it for him, to hand over the result with his own hands kept clean. Garrett Mercer asked for something a great deal harder. I want you to teach me. He turned the hat slowly in his fingers. Not to build it for me, to teach me the how of it. So I understand the why, the way that you do. He paused, the admission still working in his jaw. I've spent the whole of my life dead certain I knew how a man keeps warm on this ground. And I was wrong. And I'm too far along now to go on being wrong out of nothing but pride. He looked at her steady. Teach me about the air. And Cora felt the whole circle of it close. She felt the gray autumn morning, with its slapped granite and its hard-headed woman, fold over and meet this soft spring afternoon, with its humbled hat held in two scarred and waiting hands. He had come in the fall to save her from her folly, and he had come in the spring to be saved from his own. And the only difference between the two errands was that this time the man knew which one of them had been lost. She did not leave him standing in the mud while she savored it. She found a stick, and she crouched at the edge of the dooryard, where the ground lay bare, and she began to draw, the way her father had once drawn for her, on a stretch of wet sand, a lifetime and a whole world away. He crouched down beside her, and this time he listened. She drew the two walls, and the hollow between them, and the small vents at the crown and the foot. And she gave him the part he could not have learned from one cold visit. The breathing of it, the thing most builders never thought to ask after, until the rot had already taken hold. Mind the breathing of it above all the rest, she told him. Seal it up tight to hold every scrap of warmth, and you'll only trap the wet right along with it. And the wet will eat your good logs from the inside, while you lie there sleeping and never know. Leave it the two openings, screened against the vermin, top and bottom, and the damp will climb out on its own and leave the heat behind, and your wall will keep its peace for 100 years. He nodded, slow, taking it down into himself, scratching his own rougher version of a vent into her drawing with a blunt fingertip. And she watched the principle take root in him, and she knew it would not be pulled up again. For he was a man who, once he had the why of a thing fixed in his head, held to it the way the granite held its place down in her foundation. There was one more thing she did that spring, on a morning when the land had gone green and riotous with the brief, violent flowering it allows itself before the summer burns it all away. She took a small fine chisel from her late husband's old toolbox, the one a mason would use for the lettering of a stone, and she went round to the cornerstone, the first great block she had ever set, the foundation of the whole undertaking, and she knelt down in the wet grass, and she began to cut a name into the rock. It was slow work. Her hands, hard as they had become, were not a mason's hands, and never would be now. But she worked at it through the morning, while the children played in the still air of the hollow at her back. And by midday, she had cut into the granite the name she had carried so very far, Silas Vane. She sat back on her heels when it was done, and she looked at the name of a hard, cold man, a man who had never once told his daughter that he loved her, and had given her instead the only inheritance that had ever come to matter, the knowledge that had kept his grandchildren breathing through a winter he never lived to see, on ground he never knew the existence of. He was in the wall now, she told him without words, tracing the cut letters with a fingertip gone numb from the chisel. He had always been in it, from the very first stone. She had only made it so the children could see where. And there it was, the whole of it. A woman who had been called mad in the autumn, building in the spring sun beside a man who had come to learn from her. A grief in another house finally spoken aloud, after years of frozen silence. A hard father's cold love, cut at last into warm stone. And the still air in the hollow, going about its quiet work, asking nothing, claiming nothing, keeping its ancient peace. She had set out only to keep 2 small lives up out of the ground, and somewhere along the way, the keeping had turned itself, all on its own, into a giving. She would not have been able to say, if you had asked her, which of the 2 she was the prouder of. She did not need to say. She only stood and brushed the grass from her knees, and looked a while at the 2 things she had made that spring, the name in the stone, and the man learning at her side. And then she went inside, to feed her children, in a warm and quiet house, which was the only thing, in the end, she had ever truly wanted out of any of it.